including the aforementioned Sammy the Bull Gravano. Welcome to both of you. It's great to have you here. I know a lot of people on Twitter are going to be very unhappy, Andrew, that you're here because they like your room on social media better. But thanks for being with us. Look, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, obviously, to put all those people on the screen together. But there is a point. The point being that one wonders why a lot of these junior people are being called into the grand jury, and it is because they may just be able to corroborate something that someone else knows, or they may have heard something that nobody else has testified to yet. What do you think?
Well, certainly we've seen Cassidy Hutchinson as a perfect example of that. I think one thing that is similar, if you leave aside, obviously the crimes are extremely different. You can't compare Sammy Gravano's murdering 19 people with what's going on here. They're very different. But the issue of how do you get somebody to cooperate is something that is kind of similar. In organized crime cases, there are ways that organized crime has to make sure people don't cooperate, such as threats of murder, and there's an oath of omerta. In this case, in a public corruption case, there are also significant challenges. There's the issue of a pardon, where people sort of think about, I don't really need to flip because I might get pardoned down the road. Obviously, the former president's also very good at threatening people, both directly and indirectly, and sort of publicizing what they're doing or not doing. So that is one area where I think if you had prosecutorial experience in organized crime cases and in public corruption cases, it can be very, very useful.
So it makes me wonder, Christy, if you're one of these people, one of these lower level people, you have information, or they suspect you have information because you were in the room where it happened, why these folks, who do not in many cases have a lot of money, why they wish to resist the federal government, why they don't give it all up. And I think Andrew said some of it, that maybe there's this idea that there's loyalty, there may be a pardon down the road, they may have a job with Donald Trump, or you could exist in a world that doesn't involve Donald Trump. Tell me why it's not obvious. Walt Nauta, for instance, does not appear to be cooperating at the moment.
Right. You see Walt Nauta, and he has an attorney who is also representing lots of other witnesses in Trump world, and that attorney is being paid for by Trump. So the odds of Walt Nauta actually cooperating against the former president go down dramatically when you have that calculus. But I also think, you look at Cousin Greg on Succession, and the question he asked is, well, what will happen to me? Will you take care of me? And I think that is the question that a lot of these low-level aides are going to be asking. And I think, at least in Trump world, there may be, whether it's implicit or explicit, this idea that if I get the presidency, I'll make this go away. I will either pardon you or we will drop the case entirely. And trying to stay in that orbit, trying to stay in his good graces, because if you're not, look at what the consequences are. Look at the kinds of things he's been posting this week against, Jack Smith and his end. Yeah. It's really dark. Yeah. And so there is a fear there, much like with the mob boss, that if you get on his bad side, bad things could happen to you.
So again, the exception being Sammy the Bull, because he wasn't incidental to anything. But for the rest of them, it's often the testimony that you hear about from people who overheard something or whom the principals didn't take seriously because they're smaller players. But everybody's got a body man or an assistant or a driver or something of that nature. Are these people, do they hold critical testimony here, or is this corroboration?
It can be truly critical. In every case I've done, junior people, there's incidental people, a lot of times people who the principals don't even think about.
Right.
They're sort of there in the background, can be really compelling as to what has happened. And sometimes, even if it's just small pieces, it can be both compelling and it can corroborate somebody like, for instance, a Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen has tons of baggage. But if you have a lower level person who is in the room who can corroborate small pieces of that, that can be really compelling to a jury.
These characters that we're talking about who have been seen or who've been testifying or talking to the grand jury, why are these junior characters involved when we're so far down the road? We are any day now expecting an indictment, possibly. Why are we still talking to junior, possibly incidental people?
Well, it sounds like at least with one of the witnesses that was in the grand jury on Thursday, William Russell, this was maybe his third time in the grand jury. So what that tells me is they actually are far down the road and they are tying up some loose ends here. They clearly have at this point a prosecution memo. There is a draft indictment, and they are just finalizing what that presentation is before they ask the grand jury to vote.
And Andrew, I guess part of that is because some of this may become testimony in court. So they've got to make sure everything's buttoned up and everything matches everything else.
Yeah, and also they could have learned something new and they want to ask questions about that. It's also worth remembering just how quickly Jack Smith has moved along. And this is a very widespread conspiracy, meaning there are lots of people to talk to. So it's just not surprising to me, given the time clock, the time pressure, that there would be this many people that we're hearing going into the grand jury at sort of high levels and low levels and medium levels, because I think they're trying to work really quickly.
I want to explore with you this concept of different people saying the same thing. Our friend Michael Cohen heard you saying that he had some baggage and he wanted to understand what you meant by why would it be beneficial that somebody else may have heard something similar to what
Sure.
someone else has.
So when Christy and I were prosecutors, one of the things you do when you close is you talk about the ways in which a cooperating witness is corroborated. And you talk about all the other evidence, other witnesses, other documents. In Michael Cohen's case, just to take one example, he has admitted that he committed perjury. Now, he did that, that he said, for the president, the then president, Donald Trump. But there's also significant corroboration. So with anybody who's got baggage, whether it's Michael Cohen, whether it's Sammy Gravano, anyone, you need to be able to tell the jury, this is how you know that he is telling the truth, because look at the other evidence that it aligns with.
How does anything that Jack Smith's worrying about right now and people he's getting to talk to him affect the Georgia case? Because there may be overlap. There may be people who have similar stories to tell or who are in similar rooms or listening to similar conversations. And I'm told that it does matter that what that same person says in two different places matters a lot.
Yes, it does. This is a really unusual situation where you have federal and state prosecutors looking at the same course of conduct, potentially the same targets at the same time. Usually in the beginning of an investigation, there's sort of this David and Goliath turf battle that will happen with federal and state prosecutors, where a lot of times the federal prosecutors will say, well, come on, be a special prosecutor on our case. You can be a part of it. You can maybe delay your case or shut it down entirely. But that didn't happen here because Fani Willis got to work, rolled up her sleeves in the beginning, and DOJ did not. I mean, where DOJ initially was fearful, Fani Willis was fearless. And so she built this investigation for 2 years. The worst thing that Donald Trump could have done was announce his candidacy when he did, because that led to Jack Smith being appointed as special counsel. And he has been investigating with gusto. And it seems like he's caught up to her.
Right.
So now they're both racing to the finish line here. And, you know, they are looking at a lot of the same witnesses. And what prosecutor wants other teams of investigators and prosecutors questioning their witnesses without knowing what they're saying? They don't, right? So there has to be some coordination. If you bring in, for example, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, you're going to want to know what he said to Fani Willis first before you, Jack Smith, put him into a grand jury. You want to make sure there's consistency, and if there are inconsistencies, that you're picking up on those and following up. You want to understand what the impressions of different people in the room are. So of their credibility. So I think, you know, it is a tough situation. It's a delicate situation, but I believe that they must be communicating. They must be sharing some information where they are looking at the same kinds of witnesses and documents as they get to these final stages.
To a lot of our viewers, they might say, that's great. There's going to be these two cases dealing with the same stuff. Someone's going to get Donald Trump. Is there, if you're Jack Smith, is there something you're worried about here that I don't want these two cases moving forward at the same time?
Well, Christie's point is that you definitely have to coordinate. I mean, just to take another example, if you have a victim, you really don't want to put them through this process twice.
Yeah.
You want to do it once out of a real courtesy. You don't want to re-victimize them.
Right.
But the reason that this, although it is, I agree with Christie, an unusual case, the reason there is a legal reason to do this is those state charges, even though I think they will be a subset of the federal charges, those can stick if there is a federal pardon,
Right.
or if somebody just tells the federal case, we're going away. In other words, any Republican who wins the presidency can tell the Department of Justice, drop all federal cases. You don't even have to go to the pardon route. They can just
Right.
tell the Attorney General to stop. That does not apply to state charges. So by having these two, you do have that ability to hold somebody to account.
Thanks.